Hello, it's so nice to be here. So I'm Jakob, I'm an artist. Every time I give presentations, I try to adapt a little bit to something I just heard or something I'm feeling in the room or something. So I'll explain how I come from a world of using video games, and I had a kind of early career as well. From when I was like 15, I started building virtual environments, and then that became my creative practice. And then slowly started doing exhibitions about 10 years ago. And in this context, I'll talk about sound. I'll talk about a piece I'm showing in the Biennale called Bell Bell and two other projects, and a little bit about my journey of how I got there. So when I create work, I use a lot of technology, like video games is a fairly complicated tool, but I use it in a way where I think about it more and more as a very collaborative, almost like a compositional tool, where I go to different environments with different collaborators from a few weeks up to a year, and kind of embed myself there, work with them, with natural historians, with biologists, and then I build a world. So a literal virtual space, and then slowly over time I invite other people to enter that and participate with their own practices, interpretation with particular points of view on those natural environments that I've learned from someone else, like a biologist or natural historian. And actually my last collaborator, Oh Kyung Lee, is also here, an amazing sound artist who's visiting today. So that's to kind of give an idea of the type of work I do. I also show it in many different contexts, like art, video games, VR, film festivals, in public space. It's a very amorphous medium. Okay, so to give a context of where I want to get to in this presentation, I'll start with a project I did for the Venice Biennale in 2019 called Reanimated. There's like multiple components to it, but the starting point is the song of an extinct bird. So it's a bird, the Kawaii that became extinct in the late 80s, and that's kind of a history of a few different jazz musicians and artists working with the sound on this bird. And my starting point was a conversation with Douglas Pratt. So he spent 40 years of his life studying this bird when it was alive. And he told me that in the 60s, they knew that these birds were becoming rare and that something would happen, but it was kind of impossible for him and the other scientists to imagine that they would actually vanish. And then suddenly in the 80s, all these species of this, in this mountain wetland all became extinct. So I interviewed him on his memories and emotions around this bird, and he gave me access to sound recordings of it. So I started working with Cornell. They have this laboratory for bird recordings. I started working with the Natural History Museum in New York and digitizing like feathers, beaks, different pieces through history, and I slowly got access to a lot of material that I'll just kind of browse through some of that here. But then over time, I built this virtual landscape and musical piece. So all the work I do are very sonic, and this is something that comes from like my world in kind of more video games, where sound is like the big exciting field right now. So kind of interactive, live, generative, interactive sound, which is part of all my work. So in this installation, that's like video, virtual reality, and you hear the sound of this bird, and you hear Douglas' memory. But what really stuck with me was that he told me that he still paints the bird. And when he paints it, it's his way of bringing it back to life. So it's like a form of reanimation through his memory, but not in a way of bringing it literally back to life. So I created this project where I have all these data sets, all these natural history archives, his personal memory, and created like a musical piece where I mixed this together, where I work with someone called Michael Riesman. He created the tools for Philip Glass, like all the musical instruments. So we became friends in New York, and then he created this generative music, so your body enters this work in VR and the installation, you hear the memories, the sounds, and slowly over time, these elements connect and become more like kind of solitude or very emotional in place with the memory. So it's a piece where I really try to mix together these data sets, natural history, archives, technologies, but reach something that Douglas expressed in his interview, where at the end of it, his voice is almost bursting because it's so emotional for him to tell this story, right? So, I kind of try to mix different psychologies, emotions with the environments and the data sets. So after this project, I was doing a residency in Arles, and with something called the Luma Foundation. I was supposed to be there for 3 months, but then the pandemic happened, so it ended up being a whole year. So as this year was going on, I spent every day in the wetlands surrounding there are all these wetlands. So I put microphones in the soil. I had the opportunity to invite one collaborator from New York right before the pandemic happened, so he was staying with me for a while. And then with my own body, both with the microphones that's like spread through all these swamp areas, we got these sounds, and then with a camera, I used something called photogrammetry. So I took like 200,000 pictures over a whole year, which then became different data sets that I feed into a computer with machine learning and AI that then turn them into 3D models. So I started building this imaginary landscape based on being there for a whole year, and my kind of corporal sensibility of experiencing different perspectives of life, like what you see in the lower. Sorry, I'm very close to this mic, so I kind of want to go over here and point. The picture in the lower middle, it's these salt formations that appear after rainfall. It dries and they kind of extrude from the soil, and they're like this big in reality. But then, because of this magnifying lens, because my body's been, when I create a lot of my work, like you can see it here, I move around the object for like 5 hours or something, kind of crawl through the soil and everything, so I get all the different perspectives, all the angles. So this little model I can kind of create a whole world from. So I scale it up like 200 times. So now this little object is 200 meters large, and this is like different seasons, different for the whole year, different soil layers. It looks quite fantastical, but I think it only looks, it is fantastical in the sense that I put it together, but each individual object, it's a photographic actual element from this place. So it only looks kind of alien, I think, because we're not so used to looking at this place. So it kind of took me to a journey working with this natural history archive of the bird to looking more at the present with my body in place, looking at elements we rarely kind of pay attention to. And then the work itself is this sonic installation where like you can walk around in the space, there's speakers, there are these actual salt formations with algae and different things, and then there's 4 people in virtual reality. And it's like, as you physically move around, these 4 people in the space, they activate sounds and shapes and transformations. So those bodies in that place are kind of literally playing the work as an instrument together. And then audience not in the headset kind of see that here. But the work I'm showing here, Bell Bell, was a project that was commissioned in 2021. In its first version, I made like a new adaptation for it here. And what it is, it's a virtual swamp. And I spent 2 years in this project. I can explain first kind of how it works. It's like, this is in the Halle am Berghain in Berlin that closed during the pandemic. So for 3 months, I was invited to create this experience. There's like 50 speakers in the space, and they are spatialized to the actual echoes and everything of the architecture. But it's this virtual simulation, this video game, that is playing the actual building as a musical instrument. So there's like different variables, different conditions that shape shift and plays the music that moves around people. And so to give an idea of like what the work is, it's quite vast. It's an actual massive virtual swamp landscape. And these are some of the things you might see. But for me, it's very important, like there's a lot of conversations, like things that are very generative, but my work is extremely crafted. It's like, I go out, I scan the elements, I feel the textures, immerse myself, and for this one, I spent 2 months in canoe with a collaborator, Matt McCorkle, as well as 2 scientists from the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And then with their eyes and senses, they could show me all these like snake skins and eggs of a snail, for example, is in the piece. These large orbs that in reality is like this big, but in the work sometimes they appear. All sorts of things can kind of transmutate and appear. So I try to make a work that has this sense of continuous transformation, but strong intimacy at the same time, that kind of wraps itself around you in the image and the music. Yeah, so this is just kind of an overview of things you might see or you might not. You'd have to spend hours to get an idea of what actually appears. And then each of these transformations, they then control a big sound library. So we also recorded with microphones the wetlands in the present. And then I worked with the Natural History Museum to get sound recordings through history around Berlin and all the canals. So it kind of shuffles past, present, and I mean, I guess metaphorically future, and if you feel this is futuristic or not, I don't know. Yeah, so this is kind of a symptom of, to include this slide to kind of show how I collaborate and work, where my background in video games, it's an incredible like poetic and collaborative medium where you have musicians, you have actors, you have designers, you have a lot of really talented people, so I try to apply that to my practice more and more. So for this one, it's a collaboration between this art organization called LAS, the Natural History Museum and the scientist, the nightclub, and then this Venezuelan experimental singer Aka. So what I did, this is just another picture of the work. I go here. What I did was that I both worked in these wetlands, recorded the sounds, digitized species, and did the same, in the Natural History Archive. But then the last element is an element of mythology. So I work with this language researcher, Sabine Asmus, and she gave me access to songs that people have been singing to this place for the past 1,000 years. So apparently there's a strong theory that Berlin, the first 4 letters, B-E-R-L, is an old Slavic word without the E. So all the modern words in Berlin in the areas of roads, a lot of them with the E is so that a German language can understand an old Slavic way of speaking in a region. And brl, I'm Danish, so it's also hard for me to remove the E in that word, but it means swamp. So Berlin was created as a trade route. It's called the Ventis trade route from Eastern Europe, Germany, up through Scandinavia. And on this route, there were a lot of songs and mythologies dedicated to swamps. So in the language was like a sensibility and poetry about the place. And a central figure in this mythology is a figure called the Triglav. And the Triglav is like, in some places it's a mountain, in some places it's a tree, and in some places it's kind of an underworld. But what's common in all the stories of the Triglav is that it's a navigational system through worlds. So instead of kind of a more, let's say, Christian worldview or something where it's like you're from the soil, you're born, and you go to the heaven one way, these mythologies can go back and forth. So through spirits, through mythologies, you can enter the soil, you can enter the trees, the skies, and kind of go back and forth. So that mythology became central to how I programmed the artwork and brought multiple collaborators in. Because when you create these designs and games, it's like you have to choose some kind of logic, ideology to build from. And for me, I've done it for a long time, so it's almost like improvising, or like, I imagine for people that play jazz or something, it's like, that's what it feels like to me. So in that mixture of this piece, I took mythology and then I wrote a series of little stories that I sent to this singer Aka, and then Aka sent back series of like different vocals and words inspired by that mythology. And then basically the video game itself shuffles between these. So you have, sometimes it feels very mythological, the work is like singing to you. Sometimes it looks very natural history, scientific. And sometimes it feels kind of in some romantic past. It looks like a beautiful landscape painting. And it has variables that mixes these things together on its own. And as it does it, things mutate, they transform, and everything kind of links together. But that's what a video game technology allows you. And then it sends out sound to the speaker. So if there's like a bird in the virtual work, if it was shown in here, we would like 3D model like the room, put it on top of the virtual swamp, and then if a bird is like flying from over there to here in the virtual landscape, you're gonna kind of hear it come across. Sometimes it also breaks that logic. Like there's like a large sound that Aka sometimes sing like a little soft, and then it breaks apart, and it shifts the logic. So there's a lot of rhythm in these works, but it's also to give an idea of this relationship between emotions, memories, different sensibilities. Like there's a beetle in the work. There's like blue beetle hiding under a log sometimes, and that is there because I work with the Natural History Museum, and when you do this, work with these large official data sets, people will be like, what do you want to know? And then you kind of have to ask for something specific and scientific. But then over time, this scientist sends me an email, I love this beetle in the collection. It has not really nothing to do with what you're asking about, but I love it. So I'm like, we're putting that in there. So I also in this world put a lot of more like emotional memories. Yeah, I have 5 minutes? Oh, amazing. Right, okay. So this is 1 minute. Yeah, okay. I thought so. Just to give an idea of how it transforms from data sets to these like poetic beings. It goes into soil, and this is like the tree when it's mythological, realistic. Mushrooms. And then what I'm doing now is that I'm kind of working more like with performers. So this is like Panda Jing, another artist that invited an opera singer to do a 30-minute opera performance inside of the work, and then the work like connects to the singer in space. So now I'm thinking a lot about this kind of adding bodies into the work more. Thank you.
Thank you, Noam. Thank you, Nicola, and thank you, Sophia Park, also for having me take part in this panel. I want to just basically focus today specifically on my new commission for the Gwangju Biennale, and I think maybe what is really interesting also to Jakob is the way I use data sets, perhaps in a completely different way. And so I'm going to try and dive actually into the way I composed basically the sound installation that you see in the main biennial hall on first floor. I'm not going to play any sounds, but I'm just going to go into how I use specific data to generate sounds. So the work, hold on, just going to move on. So the work at the biennial actually looks at a specific data set from FragFocus, which is a national disclosure registry of the United States, where essentially different fracking companies have to disclose the chemicals involved in fracking. So within FragFocus, currently you find approximately 5 million entries. It's publicly available. You can basically go to fragfocus.org and look at the different wells. So we have currently, until today, between the conventional and unconventional fracking wells, around 1.7 million wells in the United States alone. Here I just basically took some screenshots of how you can navigate FragFocus. You can essentially, put in the state that you're interested in, look at the county and the city, and arrive to the wells, and then go further. Here, for example, I just basically chose North Dakota, and then look at the chemical disclosures each of those fracking companies disclose. Within my installation, I basically assembled with data scientist Gary Allison, who's an activist, but also a data scientist working for FracTracker. We decided to take 4 wells, basically across the United States, ranging from North Dakota, New Mexico, Ohio, and Oklahoma, to look at 4 specific wells and their chemical disclosures. They are sort of like within the installation represented within the different metal tube wells through which basically there's a speaker through which you can experience the sound. I think this is probably a bit too small. Yeah, it's a bit too small maybe for you to see. I hope I have this is maybe a better close-up. But what I did with Gary Allison is that we, through FragFocus, you can essentially access the specific chemicals that are involved in fracking. Overall, there are around 1,920 chemicals involved in the fracking process, whereby out of those, approximately 15% of them are trade secret ingredients and proprietary ingredients that we can't access. These 15% again can involve, because they are proprietary, can involve again another 1,000 more chemicals that we don't know because it's essentially trade secreted. So in that sense, the actual amount of chemicals involved in fracking remains fairly unknown within, trying to number them. I basically set certain parameters with Gary as to how we're going to analyze the chemicals involved in fracking. So here you see basically the parameter list of how I basically allocated different sounds and how we analyzed them. So they go from like the well ID, the chemical abstract service number, which is actually the number that you see on the video projection, to then grouping the chemicals within specific chemical groups and deciding on basically the mass. We basically assign the mass to essentially be reflected in the loudness of the sound, to the distortion level that is integrated within basically the programming of the sound through deciding how much information and the hazard signal that it gives off. So here within this screenshot you basically see already the chemical groups that we assigned these chemicals to. So in total for the 4 wells we categorized around 350 chemicals into essentially these 16 chemical groups. I hope you can see this well, but essentially from these chemical groups, then again, we have the hazard category that you see actually on the far right, which is basically categorized in dangerous, warning, proprietary, and not classified. Whereas not classified in itself is a very complicated group, because not classified on the one hand includes ingredients that we know fairly a lot about, but also not classified in the same category means also understudied chemicals that are neither dangerous nor a warning. So it's fairly complicated, but it's actually the method scientists are used to use in order to basically classify these chemicals. And then you have the hazardous chemicals that we know of that are hazardous, and then the warning chemicals that are sort of semi-studied, but where the exact danger is not fully known. And last but not least, we have basically the proprietary ingredients that are protected under trade secret law. And these, scientists speculate on are actually the most dangerous chemicals, oftentimes including PFAS chemicals. And PFAS, again, are what we call forever chemicals that are very difficult to decompose and hence have a very long lifespan and therefore are the most dangerous. What is really interesting about these proprietary ingredients is that the way scientists are using them currently, today, in the present, in order to know more about them, is actually to speculate on what they might include, because they can't access the information directly because they are protected. They actually make speculative research of what these chemicals might be. And from that speculation, they actually try to influence public opinion in order to be able to access the information. So I think what is really interesting about that part is how the present is actually almost more scary than what we might imagine as a future, because actually the present is currently unknown to the public, although the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States, has access to the chemicals. That's one of the issues, but also the other issue is that constantly there are new chemicals being developed. So science is always many, like 10 steps behind what the companies are doing, because as soon as a chemical is being disclosed, new trade secret ingredients are being patented, and then through that patent, it's trying to play, catch up, where these scientists aren't actually able to access the information. So what I did for this specific sound work is essentially group the chemicals. Within the video work, I kept it very simple. You have basically these 4 color signals that you see, ranging from blue, red, yellow, and green to indicate basically the hazard category of the chemical. But then the sound itself are then classified within these 16 groups, and then within these 16 groups we identified how many different types of chemicals are within each group, and from that group on we basically developed variations of the various sounds per group. Here, I'm so sorry that this is hard to read, but essentially here we also have basically the mass index that would influence the loudness. I mean, obviously within a group exhibition we had to adjust the noise levels, but they are relative to actually the mass index of how much chemical is being pumped into the soil. And basically I just, hold on. Okay, somehow it can't stop at the end, but yeah, and then basically the way I allocated the sound is actually quite analog. We made all these sounds from scratch together with my sound producer Alexis Chan, and then I work with a programmer, Federico Nitti, to feed the system that we built. It's another program through which we run the sounds. And essentially the length of each sound that you hear within the installation is also determined by the length of the chemical. So we just basically developed certain parameters to deconstruct these chemical systems into a sound score. I think one relevant aspect that I also want to mention within basically the way fracking chemicals currently operate is that on the one hand you have the chemical components, but the way I have spoken with scientists and researchers is that since it is such specified information, we can sort of access parts of the chemicals and part of the hazard ingredients, categories of these chemicals, but the entire knowledge about the entire body of what actually fracking does to the environment remains extremely speculative. For instance, I actually I went to the different fracking wells within the United States, in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and we took water samples that we then again tested basically for dangerous chemicals, but there aren't actually any testing tools for all the chemicals that are involved in fracking. So in the end, you only test for the, for certain metals, because these are, we have essentially testing technologies for these chemicals, whereas, for instance, for the more complex chemical components, there is not even a testing tool. And the way the EPA handles also the results of these research is that they, again, would argue that you can't know whether it was actually fracking fluids that caused these chemicals, these reactions, or whether it is other forms of material within the soil that basically spiked these chemical components. So I think I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Well, Well, thank you both. I'd like to start with a very brief framing of your practices that are clearly coming from, maybe even we can say, opposite ends. Seng's practice is highly conceptual and is building on conceptual lineage. And Jakob's, of course, is much more connected to emergent technologies, gaming, and recent other generative models. And maybe it's important to bear in mind how in those generated machines, right, that you both have worked with to some degree in different ways that we'll discuss, and of course, namely AI, we have the code that is opaque, but then we have the data set that is kind of like the deep conscience, or maybe the conscience of the AI, right? So the data set really kind of like prescribe how and what the AI will give us, the versions of the thing. And you both work with that in very, very different ways. So I want to start with a question that is a little bit more abstract, but I would love to hear from both of you. What is data for you? And maybe you can talk a little bit about how you approach that, because I know that in some of your work, you approach it as raw material, you approach it as a composition, or as translation, direct translation into something else. So maybe one of you would like to pick it up.
Okay. Well, actually, I'm very familiar with this Excel sheet of data and giving them variables. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So my work is the way I know the world in a way. It's very important to me. It's sort of, I think about it all the time. I collaborate, I go to places, I think about an environment or something. So it's how I choose to live in a way through the works I do. So in my head, it's like, okay, I grew up, for example, with the emergence of spatial 3D worlds that you can enter. And now there's also more generative tools, AI, there's an explosion of new systems that no one, I feel like, entirely knows what are, or like different fields, different people will have very different opinion on what they are and how they function. And then at the same time, that these environments changing. So when I make work, it's like I'm living in as part of that world and moving through it. So does it make sense in relationship to your question? It's like, so when it comes to using data sets or using AI, like I have, I take 2,000 photos of a mushroom or something, and then in the studio there's a computer sitting for a week, like, and then it gives me like, here's a 3D model of this mushroom, and then I kind of modify it once more artistically, like a painter or something. So I try to add again to that my own artistic interpretation, and then I'm like, hey, do you want to make this mushroom sing or something? Or a tree, maybe something that's cheesy like a mushroom or something, but to make it iconic, So it's more like I feel I live in that world, and so I try to move through it somehow, play with it, yeah.
My data set is actually fairly analog. Essentially, the way Frag Focus works is that there's still humans behind just entering the data, and oftentimes there are so many errors. Or, for instance, at times you find information where somebody literally just took a piss, like somebody just entering DNA as an ingredient, expecting that nobody is actually reading those 5 million entries. So it's actually a lot about also cleaning up the data and trying to make sense of the data, verifying the data through the chemical abstract service number, which is essentially a number that is ascribed uniquely to each chemical. We currently have 182 million chemical abstract service numbers of different chemicals. So that in itself is already such a crazy number to think about, how many variations of chemicals are out there that are being classified. And then the way I work with the data set is actually whenever there is a proprietary ingredient or an ambiguous ID, oftentimes within the sound work itself, it's reflected actually through a form of silence or a form of a low frequency sound that is sort of present, it is actually scored, but then it doesn't give much information. So the way I work is maybe exactly the opposite. Is actually allowing the void, or what we also call the hole within data, to exist in itself, to try and actually allow that gap to exist, and through that gap to understand what we cannot know or access.
Thank you. Maybe I want to ask one more question, and I'll try to focus it for each one of your practices, and then we can open for audience questions. So what is the relation that you aim to create between the real footage, or, of course, in your case, the data, right, and the fictional side or the conceptual work? And Sang, in your case, it would be really great to hear, how do you conceptually work with it in terms of scoring it, right? Because as we all know, of course, in conceptual practices, right, you apply some set of rules, and you do that. You apply some set of rules, and then you kind of like let chance operation happen within them. And it's a very, very unique approach to kind of like bring the pillars of conceptualism into the data set. And I would like if you can speak more about that. And then Jakob, for you create compositions from these, and then eventually you make choices of how to, let's say, move and shift between these technologies, where gaming engines are so based on speciality, right? But then generative models are so disconnected from any speciality, and yet you manage to create this composition that has like a melody or a narration. So it would be great to hear more about that too. So.
So the way I scored the sound is essentially, we basically had these hazard categories, ranging from, again, dangerous. I basically assigned siren sounds to the danger as a way also to mark them within the data set, but also to mark them as an really audible reaction that we also already know, right? That, the way sirens function within the public space. So they are new sounds generated, but they are based on actual siren sounds that you might know of. And then I have essentially these ambiguous sounds that in my sound composition are ranging between ghostly sounds to low frequency sounds. Ghost sounds are something that I've worked with through actually other projects already. I've done like a big project on ghost tape number 10. And then you have the proprietary ingredients that basically look from the perspective of these low sounds, but they really veer it into a void. But we try to score that void based on the minute information that we have, and the minute information is then graded again. So we had like a trade secret score that ranged from 0, meaning knowing actually essentially nothing, to 1, which is also a proprietary ingredient that had a score of 1, where we could look at certain elements that we knew within those trade secret ingredients that were impartially known, to 2 and 3, and to 4, where 4 being that we know quite fairly well what these chemical ingredients are. And 4 in my composition is actually scored through a piano, so that it's essentially the only clear sounds that you hear within the sound work. But yeah, so essentially the score decides the way, the chemicals decide the way the scores is worked, and that is then being again reflected to the overall sound work.
Amazing. So when I make work, I think a lot about composition, but not just in like a musical sense. I mean, there's also a composer, Lou O'Neill, that also works on it, but more like there's a place that I create. There's also a place you enter, And in that space, there's kind of going to be a shift in light and sound and your emotions. Maybe you forget yourself for a little bit, but then there's something that brings you back to reality, and it becomes recognizable, and you start thinking about something, and then you might lose yourself again. So there's like a cadence, you know, like in music. And literally, in the video game, you know, there's like a system, there's a code that's going, and it's firing effects, it's mixing things. But when I start making a project, I can't tell you what it exactly will become, and I can't fully tell you what you're going to experience either, because there's my part in it, but there's also like another artist, and there's like multiple voices and elements within, but there's still a very specific conceptual dimension to putting that together. Like with the Bell, it's like there's the past songs, they're there. There's like the scientific data, they're there, and then the mythologies and things, you know. So and these are built in. I mean, I always kind of struggle figuring out how technical I go when I speak about my work, but there is like this kind of sheet, but it's just code in a video game engine that runs everything. And that's highly conceptual, but it's like, I also want you to feel something very emotional, or what does it feel to live like in that reality? What does it mean having a body? And there's like metadata at the same time. It's like you can touch a plant or something. It's like, this is a weird place to live in. So I want to put people in that journey, sort of, you know, so, and there's a composition to that. There's a lot of choices, there's a lot of things I include, don't include, or a cadence, or is it fast, is it kind of disturbing, is it now soft, is it, I mean, it takes you through a range of things, which is based on a lot of research. So when I make work, I write a text, and there's like a stack of stuff and pictures and documents, but it's not like in the work as such, it's just as an artist, I need that material for you to feel and experience the work. Like, I have nothing to create without it. I have no idea what to make unless I go out somewhere or start talking to people. I have no idea in my head. It's like, there's all this stuff. But I try to navigate it in a way I can't predict, sort of, when I make it.
Yeah, no, thank you. I should have mentioned that your approach is really anchored in documentary practices to a high degree, so absolutely. Thank you so much. Maybe we can take one or two questions from the audience.
Hi, this is a question for Jakob. Yes, here. Hi. I want to know a bit about the methods that you're using related to the photogrammetry, from photogrammetry reconstruction. You mentioned that you were using some AI methods. Maybe I was wrong. But if this is the case, I was curious if, since you show some works from 2021 and more recent ones, if in 2021 you were using more, and I would say conventional photogrammetry methods, and if right now you have shifted to more deep learning based ones, say the neural radiance field method, and if that has caused an impact in the size of your data set.
Oh yeah, massively. So the older works, that's called like high precision data. So for those that use like a big camera, and then it's like a lens, like a mirrorless lens. So it's a lens that can take in lots of light information in one picture. And then I take like thousands of images of those, and then the computer sit for a week. But I'm doing a new project right now on like dreams in this forest with this researcher, and the entire project is made on my phone and a laptop. But so it's much more, you know, like, it's less precision. So the more you use AI, the more things are being interpreted. You know, it's like, the more AI you use, the less accurate. And I mean, unless it's like in medicine and it's doing samples and stuff, but in 3D and so on, it's interpretation. So that work is contrasting my body and this thing. And then I'm working on a project right now that goes into like dream spaces and different things in this forest. And that's entirely using this like AI software on my phone and just a laptop. And that's quite exciting. I mean, it's different. It always depends on the work for me and what I want to do, but it means the whole work is like me walking around this strange forest with a phone. It's like really weird. And with these scientists, and I'm like, wow, I'm so tired of the phone now, but then, I save a week in the studio, and the whole work is like created in this forest. I can't show anything of it, but yeah, for sure. But just for me as an artist, it depends on what's the tool, what do you want to do, you know, what's the end result, what's the format, and so on. Like, yeah, but massive shift in access and technology. Absolutely, yeah.
근데 데이터셋을 사용을 한다고 했을 때 보통 데이터셋이나 데이터를 많이 쓰는 쪽은 산업이나 이런 쪽에서 데이터셋을 많이 사용을 하고, 그리고 데이터셋을 산업 쪽에서는 직접 그 산업계에서 생성된 데이터나 가지고 있는 데이터들을 많이 사용을 하고 있는데, 이렇게 예술 쪽에서 데이터셋을 쓴다라고 할 때 내가 원하는 데이터셋을 어디서 가지고 오고 또 그 데이터셋을 직접 만들거나 그렇게 하는지가 첫 번째로 궁금하고요. 한 가지 더 궁금한 것은 산업계에서 데이터셋과 그런 뭐 AI 기술을 쓴다라고 했을 때는 이 데이터셋의 정확도와 AI 뭐 이렇게 회귀나 추론을 했을 때 이 결과의 정확도라든지 얘가 얼마나 예측을 잘해서 내가 원하는 미래나 뭔가를 잘 예측하는 정확도 뭐 이런 게 중요한데, 예술계에서는 그런 거보다는 좀 개인적인 생각으로는 여기서 어떤 더 창의적인 뭔가를 더 얻을 수 있을까 이런 게 더 중요하지 않을까라는 생각이 드는데, 혹시 예술계에서 쓰는 그런 AI는 어떤 걸 더 포커스로 맞추어서 그 사용하는지가 좀 궁금합니다. 네.
Yes, I use, this is a corporate data set, Frac Focus. It's basically different fracking companies that are actively fracking within the environment that are disclosing it. The accuracy is fairly well established in the sense that the chemicals that are basically not trade secret ingredients and are publicly available can be verified also through the chemical abstract service number. So in that sense, on the one hand, it is real verified information, but then when you come to the trade secret parts, there is no way of actually finding out, for anybody, neither scientists nor the public, to actually access that information. For this specific work, I actually didn't use AI in any capacity. It was much more about actually deconstructing the data that I can access through Frac Focus and try and make sense of it with scientists to really, understand the chemical components that are involved in fracking. In that sense, it was fairly manual and analog labor. But then, in order to generate the sounds and to turn it into a sound work, we then again needed to use a program because it's just such big information and vast informations of data and the way the sound is scored to then again process that information, and instead of manually doing everything, having a program through which the sounds, can come together. But I think my task as an artist in this specific project was more about trying to really understand what these chemicals entail and find a statistic approach to somehow make that accessible for the audience in space. So it was much more about translating these chemicals that are actually in our environment, in our soil, that we can't physically sense directly in any shape or form, to somehow make that audible as a way of allowing that to exist in the air and to be experienced on a physical level.
I would also add the word representation to it. It brings back representation that is often lacking in these systems. Thank you so much. We'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll be back here for UC's Parika lecture. Thank you.